So it is a brain disease.
Oh,
You
yeah.
are being driven incessantly, right, to satisfy these cravings in order to make yourself feel a particular way. It may start off as an experiment. It may start off as a coping mechanism, right? But then because, and I tell people all the time, if you got a fever, I think we talked about this. If you got a cold and you get a fever, the fever can be 105 degrees. Now, you're going to die. You get that eye and you don't control it, even though the fever is not the primary cause. It's a symptom. That's how it is in our community. The substance use disorder, the addiction is not, it is a symptom, right?
Of an underlying event.
Of an underlying, or events, period.
Very much so.
Yes, ma'am.
Very much so.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Survivalist Tactics Speaking, episode number 7. I've got Mataka back, Mataka Askari. He told us a lot about trauma when he was here before. And we want to continue that conversation because there's a lot of people out there that are dealing with it at so many different levels that sometimes they can't even identify what type of trauma they might have experienced, are experiencing, and we don't want them to keep on in this cycle. So you were telling us about how it affects the brain, and we just got to touch on that. So I'm gonna turn it over to you and tell us.
So one of the things you just talked about, the different type of traumas that we're dealing with. That's called complex trauma. That means that so many traumas are interwoven to it's hard to identify which one is the primary behavior. So when we talk about the brain actually transforms through the science of neural plasticity, and the DNA is changed through epigenetics as a result of exposure to prolonged trauma that's passed down through cultural, multi-generational, and transgenerational trauma. One of the things I tell my people all the time about how stress and how trauma impacts the body is, if you are always in a heightened state of awareness as a result of your trauma, then what happens when you're in a heightened state of awareness? Say your stress response is triggered. What happens is your body dumps cortisol, right, and adrenaline into your bloodstream. That cortisol and adrenaline goes to your limbs to prepare you for heightened interaction with the environment.
Fight or flight.
Fight or flight. So,
okay.
But what happens where does that extra blood come from?
Your brain.
Your brain, all your vital organs, your brain, your lungs, your kidneys, your heart. And so if you stay in a heightened sense of awareness and you're always in stress response and your body is always reacting and pushing blood to your limbs to prepare for heightened interaction with the environment, what happens to the blood supply, or what happens to the organs that are supposed to operate off the blood supply? Right?
They're depleted.
And so it taxes them and it ages them faster. It's known that trauma and stress decrease your lifespan by 20 years. And trauma has also been seen to increase 7 of the leading 10 causes of death in the United States of America. Trauma, 7 of the leading 10. So that means that if we can identify some traumas, we can develop some healthy coping mechanisms and some healing methods, then we literally could decrease our chances of dying of 7 of the 10 causes of death, leading causes of death in the United States.
Well, how does someone identify what type of trauma that they're dealing with if there's so many different types? Now, I know I don't expect you to go through them all because you're coming back. You're going to tell us more. But what are some of the main things that people need to know if they're experiencing this, if they're experiencing this, if they're experiencing that? And let that lead us into a segue of how can I start addressing this?
So one of the things I feel like we need to do, there are several assessments and tests out there that people don't know about. Last time we talked about the Adverse Childhood Experiences test. They have a Philadelphia version of that with 5 different questions or 5 additional questions that take into consideration. So ACEs, in its original form, is abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. The Philadelphia expanded experiment includes community stuff.
Yeah, so, like if you're in a violent neighborhood and you're worried about gunshots or someone got killed up the street and you're 3-4 years old, how do you wrap your mind around that?
Do you wrap your mind around it?
Well,
it
let me
becomes
tell you,
normalized.
I didn't grow up in a bad neighborhood. I grew up in a neighborhood that was it could go either way depending on, who you were and what you were getting into. When I wanted to be good, I was doing good. When I found those bad kids, I found out where they were. And I found my own trouble to get into. However, when I was young, my friend, because I lived right next to Worlds of Fun, we all grew up together. She died on the Timberwolf. I don't know if you remember this. It's a amusement park ride in Kansas City. And I think we were 14 years old, and it bothered me to no end that young people could die. Like, I didn't think that one of my friends could die. and it haunted me. And my whole family knew the girl, so this was just a freak accident in an amusement park. I couldn't imagine gun violence.
So when we talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, it's the stress that you acquire that drives your behavior right after a traumatic incident. So what happens is your behavior is displayed a certain way after you experience a traumatic event. What if trauma is normalized in your community and you live in trauma 24/7?
Well, then you're always in that heightened state. You're always losing blood. You're always prepared for this state.
And let's look at the symptoms. Hypervigilance. What that means is I'm always on guard from an impending duty. A feeling of a foreshortened future. When you listen to the music, you can identify. The rapper Lil Boosie said, "You are OG when you 25." Now, when I was growing up, you wasn't an OG at 25.
No,
that's
not
a
at
feeling
all.
of a foreshortened future. It's in the language. An inability, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger. We see this behavior in our community, right?
Let's go back to the verbiage. OG, original gangster.
Yes.
Nobody was that at 25. You don't have enough time under your belt to have been out there and,
Right.
in a gang atmosphere or in a prison sphere at 25 to have done anything. Now, it's the GOAT. You can be a football player. You can be the greatest of all time. You could be an OG as far as, people use it. I go to church and we have a life group. They call themselves lifers. They don't, and they have no concept of what lifers really means. Right. So when he says OG at 25, that means that you're ready to go in retirement or anything could happen to you. You've already lived a complete life at 25.
At 25, so that is clearly the sense of a foreshortened future because you don't believe that you will make it to 50 or 60 because of the reality of what we're facing in our community, the level of violence that we experience every single day shows us that people do not necessarily make it to that age. It's rare that we have people that are in the streets involved in the subculture, right, that make it to 50 or 60. Either if they make it to 50 or 60, they're usually in prison.
Or on drugs. Yes, and they haven't been able to escape from that. I want to go back to the mind. So it's changing your neural pathways.
Absolutely. And so what happens is people associate addiction with a moral weakness, but it's a brain disease. So through neuroplasticity, your brain is changing all the time. And so a lot of people who feel like, man, a person has a craving, they should just stop, ignore it and all that. It's not that simple. So it is a brain disease. You are being driven incessantly, right, to satisfy these cravings in order to make yourself feel a particular way. It may start off as an experiment. It may start off as a coping mechanism, right? But then because, and I tell people all the time, if you got a fever, I think we talked about this, if you got a cold and you get a fever, the fever can be 105 degrees. Now, you're going to die. You get that iron, you don't control it, even though the fever is not the primary cause. It's a symptom. That's how it is in our community. The substance use disorder, the addiction is not, it is a symptom, right?
Of an underlying event.
Or events, period.
Very much so.
Yes, ma'am.
Very much so.
Yes, ma'am.
So we talked about, you grew up in St. Louis. You didn't grow up with a lot of money. You didn't grow up with, the things that you needed to, probably fit in at school, feel comfortable at home, have the things that you needed. So do you feel like being impoverished infects your mind?
Absolutely.
And trauma?
Yes, poverty is an adverse childhood experience.
What can we do to change that?
Man, we got to figure out. So first off, poverty is a mindset. I believe, man, that we live in a system where people don't teach them to believe in themselves enough. We always ultra critical. We always comparing ourselves to other people. So when we looking to model ourselves after other people because somebody has made them the standard, we rarely learn ourselves.
Absolutely. And we don't see realistic images of people on television.
Nope. I just was telling some guys today, listen, man, it's a whole bunch of areas of employment and potential areas of wealth other than basketball and rapping, other than football.
Absolutely. Where are our scientists? Why aren't we grooming our kids that, hey, if you want to be an employee at NASA, if you want to work for Boeing, if you want to be, an engineer and build just the newest type of technology that's ever existed, you have that potential. Instead, we work, we ignore things, we're not paying attention the way we should, and it kind of makes me go back to, how do you feel about violence that kids, I know we talked a little bit about music, but what they see on TV. Now, there's all sorts of unrealistic things on there, and we even talked about role models. So is there I'm just going to ask you this. Is there something in particular that you've seen on television, just at whatever time in your life, that you really felt like was letting society, our children, letting us down?
Like almost everything. Almost everything on TV. It either promotes...
Wow, I didn't expect that.
It either promotes division in the form of racism, in the form of gender, in the form of sexual orientation. It glorifies and glamorizes violence. It lends legitimacy to criminal activity and disguises it as political activity. We see people in the community. We see rap, for example, right? I tell people all the time, if you did not have any knowledge of rap music and you were just listening to culture, and you heard rap, you would think we hate our women.
Yeah.
You would think we hate our women because every other word is a profane word in reference to them, and so you would think that we would hate. You think we hate our women, and so yes, these are the things that I believe that the media, and then like one of the other people, man, we have to get away from comparing ourselves to other people because it depreciates the value of our life, and we are always chasing an image and an identity that is not naturally ours.
Going back to being impoverished. If I know I don't have the things that someone else has, then I'm not going to feel as though my life is just as valid as theirs, when in actuality it is. I have just as much potential. I have just as much potential.
So poverty breeds despair, and despair breeds criminality, right? So now here it is. I'm broke, right? I'm in the community. I'm seeing these things that I feel like I don't have access to, and now these other routes have become available to me. I can steal, I can burglarize, I can
sell drugs.
Yep. And so what happened was sometimes we take advantage of those that are in our midst because we don't believe we're capable of achieving certain goals through another way.
Yeah.
Right. Because we have not been conditioned to understand that we're capable of stuff. Malcolm X. He said this. Malcolm X said in the 8th grade that he wanted to be a lawyer. His teacher told him, now, that ain't a realistic goal, so you should be something like a carpenter. We take away
from each other
who they want to be, their identity, the things that they strive for. And so a healthy identity is important, and poverty, right, will prevent you from accessing a healthy identity because you in survival mode. You ain't trying to figure no spiritual stuff out. You're trying to eat.
Exactly. And I'm glad you said something about spirituality, but I want you to remind our audience, how many years of your life did you leave? Did you have to lose due to incarceration, due to drugs?
23 and a half years.
And was that a result of the crack cocaine disparity?
Ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
23 and a half years because of trauma that led you to make decisions that made you to be in places and spaces where you didn't have opportunity. So trauma manifests in a lot of different ways. We were talking about, a soccer mom who somehow gets into the opioid epidemic. These are real issues. These are real things that are affecting people. And then once that mind shift has come, and it is a result of your mind. It is a result that,
it's an identity shift.
Yes.
I tell people all the time, we struggle with human problems because we forget our divinity. Right?
That's right.
And so as you start to do an identity shift, right, you start to access areas of power inside yourself that you were cut off from because your mind couldn't recognize them. As you start to develop and mature and you have that identity shift, right, a whole nother area of information and power, you gain access to that.
Absolutely. So when the trauma stops, it's the same as, I would believe, stopping using drugs. Now, I was incarcerated for a long period of time. People would come in and out. God's still working on them. That's what I would say. Their testimony's still being written. Yes. However, when they sit down and get a good 4 or 5 years, I'd say, hey, you're getting better. Your brain is healing. Your brain has to heal from addiction, from trauma.
Terrence Gorski said 5 years. Terrence Gorski is one of the leading scientists on substance use disorder, addiction, post-acute withdrawal, all of the things that accompany that trauma. And he said that a person, especially now, this is what really struck me. Say you're going in front of a judge, you detoxing, right? And they're hitting you with all these offers and with this time. Terrence Gorski said that a person should not be expected to make a life-changing decision of that magnitude, right? Or any life-changing decision of great magnitude for at least 5 years after they've gotten off drugs.
That's absolutely correct. And I could speak to that all day long because I had many years to think that I would have fought harder for myself if I wasn't in a state of perpetual trauma traumatization. I was traumatized by my crime. I was traumatized by the life and the actions that led up to it. I was traumatized by the system, by the lawyer, the public pretender. So, and faced with a big decision, let's round it all out. So now you got your average person. They've been a victim of trauma. They've had things in their life. They're in this hyper acute state. Is that a good word for that?
Ma'am.
They're in this hyper acute state. Now it's time to make decisions. How can they, through trauma, information, or being informed, somehow get to the healing point where they can make everyday decisions and be healthy? I know it's more than just counseling. How can they work on themselves? How can they shift?
Right. So one of the things that I do, I don't know what anybody's spiritual system is, but I meditate. That's important to me to become grounded. It was something that I did in prison every day because prison is like, it's routine based. So basically you had everything the same every day. And so because it was so predictable, I was able to get up in the morning and meditate to stabilize my mind, to absorb the impact of what I knew I would experience in the day without having a negative response. So meditation prepared me to deal with the things that normally would have triggered me and put me in a bad place. I've used that same skill out here, that I ground myself, right? That's a lot of studying, because studying fills your mind up with information, and it introduces into your mind, different coping strategies and techniques. So I would say gather information, and then I would say think about a spiritual exercise you want to engage in: prayer, fasting, meditation.
I like to call it stealing your mind.
Be still and know that I am God. That's a biblical verse.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying now. You think I said steal. I mean STEEL, because I tell people
steal.
sometimes I'm made of steel because I have to be.
Steal. Okay.
Yes,
okay.
because
yes,
I have to be.
Yes, ma'am. Ain't no
All
doubt.
right.
Ain't no doubt.
Mataka, thank you. Thank you so much for coming back. And we will continue the conversation on trauma, how we change our mindset, how we change who we are, how we transform, how we get to that inside state where we can call on something bigger than ourselves, steal our mind, or ground ourselves.
Trauma blocks the realization of your divinity. Once you remove it and you access your divine mind, your life changes.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Yes, ma'am.
Now I want you to come back next week.
Next week it is.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.